Welcome to Theo's Thoughts, and today's episode is basically about the books that I read in January. Last year, I went through a pretty intense reading phase that wasn't really discovered until Fourth Wing was released, and that just unlocked the teenage version of myself that just loved reading all sorts of stories. And last year, I think I read about 60 or 70 books, which I know isn't a lot compared to some of these book talkers, which is fine. But I realised that from each story you tend to learn something, or you at least figure out what you enjoy and what you don't, and you learn a little bit more about yourself. So this year I thought, as part of the podcast, every month I would go through the books that I had read and what I enjoyed about them, what I didn't, and sort of my overall rating. Just a sort of quick, nice little review. I've got other book reviews on my website for books that I really enjoyed and really wanted to talk a little bit more about, but generally some of the books that I read, there's just not that much that I can say about it. Anyway, let's get right into it. So the first one is I'll Always Be With You by Monica Murphy. So I read A Million Kisses in Your Lifetime at the start of last year, and it was just kind of cute. It's a romance. It's okay. It's alright. But it's nice because it's sort of young love, first loves, all of that kind of thing. And I don't know, I kind of like her storytelling of these characters and the grumpy versus sunshine kind of thing. So it's an easy read. We'll start with that. It took me only 2 days, but it was also during the bank holidays. So the main points are, it's a love-hate relationship. It's the two main, popular people, or the two most well-known people in the school. Which then brings me to, it's a high school romance. Enemies to lovers, kind of elite feeling, and you also have a dual point of view because you have it from his point and her point, which I think is nice because we always wish we could know what other people are thinking. The things that I sort of liked about it, the beginning of it feels different because it starts straight away with this summer romance, something that I think many readers enjoy reading about, albeit they're a little bit younger because I think they're like 17, 18. But it's a real nice jump straight into the story. They have this instant connection. You fall in love with both of the characters almost immediately, and it feels like they're soulmates. Then they get thrown into their school setting and they become enemies. They thought they'd never see each other again. Obviously, then they end up going to school together. They both have their family issues. So the book follows the development of how they overcome those sort of obstacles that lead them to have miscommunications, that lead them to dislike each other more. It's nice. One of the biggest takeaways that I had is that you actually see the growth of characters, because often these romance books follow a really short period of time, and these guys are really young at the start of the book, but there are different time periods and time jumps, which means you actually get to see the development of their characters as they grow up, as they learn to understand what love is. One thing I've got to say about Monica Murphy's style is that she really is good at making the chemistry clear. You are rooting for these two characters to get together, and that's what you like, because it's disappointing in a book where it feels forced between two characters. That's not what you want. We like the story, we like to go away with that sort of warm feeling. There were quite a few dislikes that I had of this. There are two characters in there, Brent and Sadie. It felt like there was going to be something major happening with them, some sort of real clear story, some drama, some miscommunication, and there wasn't. They just sort of seemed irrelevant by the end, which just seemed a bit random from a story perspective. One of my issues, which I think is just, it's tricky because there are so many stories where the unpopular person has mousy brown hair, dark eyes, petite kind of looking. The main character in this, she is described as having blonde hair, blue eyes, which typically is sort of popular, and she's unpopular in most of this story. So it just feels a little bit, I don't know, just off, I suppose, as you're reading it. It's difficult to believe that she's not liked by a lot of people. There's not that many twists, as you'd expect, about one of the main characters' business. It felt like there should be something big uncovered, and there just wasn't, which is fine. It's just, again, a little bit disappointing. By the end of the book, the characters are in their 20s, and I understand that you grow up a lot in your 20s, but your 20s are a time for figuring out who you are, and these guys feel like they're in their 30s by the end of it. It just doesn't, again, it doesn't feel natural with the amount of character development that they're still sort of in their early 20s. It doesn't sit right with me personally, but it was still an enjoyable story. You just sort of have to overlook that, and I just decided that in my head I would adopt them as being sort of more like 30, 35 rather than in their 20s. Overall, I gave it a 6 out of 10. It's alright, it's a nice book, it's a cute read, but it's also not that memorable. Considering it's about a month ago that I read it, I don't remember that much about it, to be completely honest, hence why I have to look through my notes. The second book that I read was Kira and Me by Noel Fitzpatrick, aka The Super Vet. I have a dog. I lost some other animal family members last year, and this was a story that I thought would be really nice, and it reminded me of The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse. It had that sort of poetry feel, it had a lot of illustrations, and it's this story about friendship, and how could I not, right? We love our four-legged friends, they are our family, so it was something that I sort of wanted to have on my bookshelf, and I wanted to have a read. I was a little bit disappointed, not gonna lie. It's firstly a story that feels more like a letter to his dog as such, like what he learned from his dog. It's the whole book is a story, basically. It's a conversation between the dog and the owner, and them figuring life out together as such. There's a lot of references to Light and Love from the Stars, which is something that I enjoyed. A lot of illustrations, and some of them were kind of cute, but I don't know, I also felt like the illustrations were lacking in some way. They just felt a bit messy, I suppose. Like, to put it bluntly, when something tries to mimic being artistic, but it's not, that's just how I felt. It's obviously personal preference. It's just not something that I particularly felt anything looking at, apart from this just is a little bit ugly to look at. It was a nice story of understanding between dogs and humans. That it was kind of nice, like that sort of bond. But the thing I loved most, actually, and I wish that he had put this at the start of the book, was actually the afterword. There's a deeper explanation about the story between him and his dog, and you really feel it then. You really get to know them, and you get to feel how deep his love for that dog was, and how much she impacted his life, like they often do. But throughout the actual sort of poetry bit, didn't feel it. And that was actually my main dislike. It just didn't feel like a clear story, considering it is presented to be a story about a dog and a man and their friendship. It didn't feel like that. It felt a little bit jarring because it was more like a collection of poems that weren't really poems. And as I said earlier, it sort of just felt more like a personal letter to his dog, the thoughts that he was having and wanted to express, or wished he could have somehow expressed to his dog. It was also really sad. Like, I shed a tear or two, and I didn't feel happy or uplifted or inspired by the end of it. Because there are obviously stories that are emotional, but we still take away something positive, and for this one, it just felt like loss. There were obviously poems and written bits that were meant to be positive, but the feeling just didn't carry. It felt really sad. It's the main points that I sort of wrote down of what it is about, which, as I said, it is about their friendship and the bond between man and dog. It's kind of nice in a way because some of the poems feel like life lessons about people being different. You can't really own a living being as such. There's this concept of loving, losing, that love and loss, and dealing with grief. It's kind of nice. I'm still glad that it's on my shelf, but at the same time, it's definitely not something I would pick up were I to want to feel happier. So for that reason, unfortunately, again, I gave it a 6 out of 10 because it was impactful. I can still visualize it very clearly, even though it's been about a month. Very short read, but it does stay with you. It's just not necessarily staying with me for positive reasons. Right, the third book of January that I read. This one took me a little bit longer. It's not a long book, but it just took me a little bit longer back to the real world. Is called A Twisted Love Story by Samantha Downing. It took me just over a week to read, I think. And it's more of a thriller. So it's not a romance, although it sounds like it is. It's sort of like about a toxic relationship. There's this ongoing mystery throughout it. It touches on sort of obsession. Think about the books like Before I Go to Sleep, stuff like that, where there's a mystery to be solved, something's going on, something's not too right, but it follows these two characters who just are in love with each other, but their relationship is clearly very toxic, and they carry some sort of secret, and as the story goes on, we find out what that secret is. I really enjoyed the way it's written in third person, but it follows the different characters very quickly. You don't stay with one character in their sort of viewpoint for too long. It's interesting as well because it's obviously written in that, I can't think of the style properly, but although it's in third person, you can tell that it is heavily influenced by that character's preconceived sort of history, their ideas of life. And that's kind of interesting because you realise again how wrong you can be. You as the reader draw your conclusion very quickly, especially we're given obviously the title, we have the blurb to go on, and you see how quickly we draw conclusions, and by the end of it, that actually might not be the case. Something I enjoyed about it, which I haven't really read in a book for a while, was this constant mystery of true feelings and motives. The two main characters, as I said, they're meant to be in love with each other, they're meant to be super into each other even though it's toxic, but through the telling of their viewpoints, we start to question how deep is their love, how true is it actually, and are they just using each other? Do they actually love the other person, or do they love what they're getting from the other person, if that makes sense? It's interesting because you know that it will be solved by the end, or that it should be, otherwise that would be frustrating. But yeah, it's an interesting one to not know as the reader how they feel, especially when you have dual points of view. It's normally clear how the other person feels, but there are all these sort of weird thoughts behind it that you're just not sure. Is it genuine love driving that person? Are they trying to set each other up? What's happening, really? Because, full disclosure, there's police involved, there's murder involved, it's that kind of thing. And unraveling of the past is something, again, really enjoyed that you just find out in these bite-sized chunks what actually happened. It keeps you reading on. It's not super quick with how it does that, which can feel a little bit sluggish, but it's still interesting to see how they do that. Every single character in that story has their flaws, which I love personally, because as humans, we all do have our flaws and we all have issues. That's explored properly in this, so we're not particularly rooting for any character because we see their good and bad straight away. We're not biased in any way. The reveal at the end, that is a big one for me of why I enjoyed it, because I found it a bit slow at times. which is one of my dislikes, is this sort of slow reveal. But the reveal at the end is worthwhile. You sort of could put it together. Like in hindsight, looking back, there were enough clues, but it's still enough that it's like, now I get it. However, on that note, although the mystery is revealed, the actual way the ending is written was quite unsatisfying for me. Didn't enjoy it. I wanted there to be more justice. I wanted there to be some sort of big drama, but there wasn't. It's alright. It's a little bit of a repetitive story. I feel like to be interesting enough, you could have halved it. For me. That's why it took me a little bit longer to read, because you put it down, you're not really that interested to pick it back up again because you know not a lot's going to change. And it didn't. It's a slow reveal, and as I said, every character is flawed, which I like in reading, but it also in a way is a dislike because not one character of that story was written in a way that you actually like them. That's a problem, because then you don't care what happens to them. So that was a little bit frustrating in a way, because yes, they can be flawed, but you should still want them to succeed in something. You want to follow their story, and with this one, not really bothered. Not bothered if they were caught, not caught, thrown under the bus, framed. It didn't bother me that much, so I didn't really connect with it. It's another 6 out of 10. Seems to be a theme for the month of January. They all seem to sort of be 6 out of 10, because it was an interesting enough read, a story that still stayed with me. I don't know if it'll stay with me in 6 months' time, but it's worth reading. Book number 4 is Dear Aaron by Mariana Zapata. I hope I said that right. I read Lukov with Love, I think. That was the first book of hers that I read, and I loved it. I loved the slow burn romance, and then I bought another one of her books, Rhythm Chord and Something, which I read last year as well. Enjoyed that. Again, another slow burn romance. The reason that I enjoy her books is because they are stress-free. I feel like they're somewhat predictable in the ending, which I enjoy from a romance because I want there to be a happy ending. I don't want to root for the characters and then be disappointed. This one was different because it was half of it was a collection of emails and messages, which I loved. Haven't read a book like that in a while. They start off as long distance pen pals, like through an army sort of pen pal scheme. So he's away at the army, and that's why it's called Dear Aaron, because she starts every message with Dear Aaron. It's a friends to lovers. There's no big drama in that, and it's sort of like a military romance. Really enjoyed it. Loved the emails, messages, and then to normal narration. I was surprised how well she managed to reveal information through the emails and messages. It's also nice in a way because you really get to know the characters, and you also get to feel how they feel about each other, because when we're reading from their point of view, we are told pretty much how they feel. When we're reading the messages as if we were receiving them ourselves, it's a little bit more ambiguous. So is the flirting really flirting? Is it friendly? Are they being quirky? Like, it's interesting. I really enjoyed that part of trying to understand their feelings as they were speaking to each other through messages. I also loved how natural the feeling sort of developed. There was, again, going back to this slow reveal through these messages, I found her way of revealing the past to be done really elegantly and subtly. We find out so much about these characters in such a short space of time, but it doesn't feel like an info dump. We listen, we sort of, read. But you feel like you're speaking to them, and you get to know their history the same way that you would a friend. It's really naturally done, really nice to read. I also really enjoyed as those feelings sort of developed, and you can feel it sort of, is Aaron's jealousy and protectiveness that comes through in some of the messages. The second half of the book was perfect. There was like a little romance novel all on its own, because they finally get to meet in person. Everything's real and it's lovely, and the way that they interact with each other is so gentle and kind. It's how you would want to be treated. It's how you should treat others. It's why I enjoy her work, as I said, because there's no toxicity, there's no real drama. They have their flaws as well, they're learning, but they're just kind to each other, which is what we should really aim to be as people. Onto the dislikes. There were a couple of moments reading the emails and messages that felt a little bit monotonous. It's difficult because in hindsight, I don't really remember feeling like that, but I've written it down, so I must have felt like that. So I assume because it's quite a big book, that it just does maybe get a little bit boring of like, oh, this happened today, that happened today, this happened today. And although you learn to love these characters, you're starting with strangers and you have no reason to be rooting for them. There is nothing there to start with that you really are holding on to. And because of that, it can just feel a little bit boring while they're in this sort of friendly stage and just chatting backwards and forwards, sort of. Again, it's like, I'm not sure I care. But obviously by the end of it, I did really care. I know it's a romance, I know it's a slow burn romance, I know I said about predictability, but one thing I sort of didn't like is that Aaron was just a little bit too perfect. He's meant to be sort of slightly older, but I say that again, he's in his 20s, late 20s. And I just feel like he's presented just to sort of be the perfect guy. He looks perfect. He's so kind. He's so generous. He's so caring. He's so gentle. Like, he has his sort of moody moments, I suppose, if you want to say that's a flaw. But it just, I don't know, he just came across like too much of a perfect character to be believable. That's the only thing that sort of takes you out of this fictional world, is that you realise it's this, people like this don't exist. Or at least I haven't met somebody like that. There was one other issue that I had again with a character that was underdeveloped, which was Max, Aaron's best friend. Felt like there was going to be some drama there. Felt like something was not going to be great. Sort of was thinking, is it going to be like love triangle? Are they going to fall out? No. He just felt a bit random. He was sort of around and it felt like he was important, but it seemed like she almost just needed other characters to support Aaron being real. Because obviously that would be a red flag, right? If Aaron had no friends and no family that he was around. So he has his best friend, Max. I don't know. It didn't feel like a fully developed character, and the bond between him and Aaron just sort of wasn't there for me. I didn't quite get it, and that was a little bit disappointing. But considering the length of the book, I mean, there's not many complaints. So overall, I gave it a 7 out of 10, which means we are on the up and up for January. The 5th and final book for January is a non-fiction one called Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess by Dr. Caroline Leaf. I've heard of her before. She's got a ton of books out. This is the first one I've read because I was feeling a little bit overwhelmed. I thought, yeah, my mind's a little bit messy. Let's see what this is about. It took me a little while to get through. There's a lot of science. So it's basically a mind management system. How to battle negative thinking, how to reconstruct thoughts. It's obviously like a self-help book. With a lot of science about the mind, and that the mind and the brain is different. You've got your conscious mind, your unconscious mind, and your non-conscious mind. And your non-conscious and unconscious are different. It's, okay, I'm going to be real with you. It was very complicated. That's like the first dislike that I put, is that there's a lot of science. There's a lot to wrap your head around. There's a lot to understand, which is just a little bit tricky. You get tired reading it. It's not that clear what she's saying. Obviously, she spent her life dedicated to this cause, so for her it's probably very simple. For me, not so much, but that's just something to be aware of. It's not a simple self-help book. It's not like a lot of practical tips. It's a mind management system that is very heavily explained in this book, and how it works, and everything in your brain. It's a lot. Which again, if I'll start with the dislikes, just because that's where we're at now. So it confused me until the last 50 pages. I understood what the 5 steps were, which were supposed to like help you sort out your thinking, which is gather, reflect, write, recheck, and active reach. That's it. Those are the 5 steps. That's pretty much the whole book in terms of the steps, but then it's just explained a lot. So I was super confused what those steps meant until the last 50 pages. I didn't get it, and I was like, this has actually just made my mind messier. But again, it did make sense in the last 50 pages, so you just have to be patient with it, and obviously really take your time reading it and rereading it. The good thing is, in those last 50 pages, there are step-by-step examples, especially for sort of generic thoughts of like bad habits or bad eating habits, bad exercise habit, bad sleep habits, those sorts of things. There are step-by-step examples to show how you would use those 5-step sort of mind management systems to overcome the negative thinking. There are a lot of explanations. Again, as I said, science talk, they are there. I did really enjoy the explanations to the scientific parts and like the health effects of negative thinking. Really enjoyed learning about that scientifically, how this sort of negativity does impact you. There are a lot of diagrams, a lot of coloured sort of, I think they are images, like brain scans. Those are really interesting to look at. There's explanations to everything. She hasn't missed a bit, so you really can gain an understanding. You just have to be patient enough to read through it. There's a lot of sort of doable tips, which is nice. This sort of, the concept itself is really doable, and she's not trying to suggest you change your life overnight. She's not saying that you should just change everything. It's really simple. She's basically saying dedicate half an hour a day for 2 months and it will be life-changing. The overall feel of the book is pretty motivational. You feel like you actually can sort your mind out, you can sort your thoughts out, that it's not that difficult, that we all struggle with similar things. It's realistic enough with progress that it's not expecting you to be a changed person in a week. So it's definitely a good book. It's just one of the more complicated self-help books that I've read. So on that note, it's an 8 out of 10. I enjoy the mind management system. I enjoy learning bits about the brain that otherwise you don't really get a chance to learn about. How often do we really research stuff like that? Unless it's our job. So yeah, it's an interesting read, worth going through if you have the patience. She also has an app, but it's a monthly subscription, so I don't know how I feel about that, given that you just buy a book and then in order to be able to use the stuff in the book, you might need an app. I don't know. That's the sort of negative, but I don't want to put that sort of thoughts sort of behind my rating, because it's not really fair. The book itself, decent. Yeah, decent. Definitely interesting. And that's pretty much it for January's reads. I think 5 books is decent. My goals are sort of like 4 books a month, which is like a book a week. So that's what I'm aiming for. Hopefully February will be interesting too. Maybe a bit more variety. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this slightly different podcast. And hopefully you'll join me next time.